The following message is from Grace Point, an evangelical free church in Tucson, Arizona. We pray that you'll be encouraged and challenged by the Word of God so that you trust fully in Jesus Christ. More information is available at our website, www.gracepointtucson.org.
Wow, that's a lot that happens in a brief text, isn't it? Not only a lot of history and very few words, some of what at first contradiction in the coverage of people and events. A lot about what real faith really means. And a lot of the results of acting in faith. It's an exciting text, a challenging text, an encouraging text. Hebrews 11 is all about faith, what it is and what it does. It's called by many Bible scholars Faith's Hall of Fame. Notable great people in Old Testament history are named. Notables who were great leaders of the faith, like Abraham and Moses, and to some who were not so notable, like Rahab, the prostitute. The chapter starts with the best definition of faith I know of in all the Bible. I like it the way it reads in the New Living. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. All of us live every day, every moment of the day by faith. You realize that? Even though we don't usually use that word for what we do. When the alarm goes off in the morning, we trust the alarm is correct by faith. We turn it off by faith, believing that it's going to stop. We put our feet on the floor, believing it will still be solid enough to hold our weight. We flip a light switch on, believing the electricity is going to turn a light on. We start some coffee, believing that it's going to taste good and give us that little start we need with the caffeine. We turn on the shower, having faith that in a few moments there will be hot water. We sit down in a chair believing it's going to hold us. I could go on, but you know what I mean. We live by faith. It's true in the physical world, but it's especially also true in the spiritual realm. We stake our welfare in time and eternity on faith. Faith that there is a God, and if our faith said there is a God, we rest on the kind of God we believe He is, whether He is involved in our lives and whether He's looking out for us, and whether He has that promise of hope for eternity that we expect. In our text this morning, we'll find some phenomenal illustrations of faith. Faith that really made a great difference. The faith that made Moses what he was. Faith that established Israel as a nation. And faith that changed at least one individual's life radically. Faith is not just a mental exercise, but it's active and produces very special results here and now and forever. Our text gives us 5 acts of faith, each of which made a really significant difference. Let's look into the text. First, verse 27, we find an act of faith establishing his identity. Hebrews 11:27. By faith he, that is Moses, left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Of course, this is about Moses. He's the guy talked about from the beginning of the text that was read earlier, verse 23. When he was born, it was the law in Egypt that all Jewish boy babies be killed. But Moses' parents hid him for 3 months. I can imagine the problems involved in a baby crying and trying to keep him quiet. After 3 months, they put him in a basket and floated him on the Nile, where the Pharaoh's daughter bathed or went swimming. She found him and fell in love with him right away. and took the baby home to raise him as her own. Naturally, she got a slave to do all the dirty work, the menial tasks. After all, she was the daughter of Pharaoh. The menial tasks like changing diapers, feeding him, bathing him, cleaning up all the messes, and so forth. By family trickery, and of course by God's sovereign design, the slave nursemaid was Moses' true natural mother. Some commentaries say that we can't speculate how Moses came to realize his genetic identity. I think it's very clear that his real mother taught him at her knee the stories of Israel, undoubtedly taught him some little simple songs about God. She talked to him about the true God, and he grew up in Egyptian schools. Even though he may have learned Hebrew from his mother, he grew up in Egyptian schools with all the best learning available to Egyptians. In language skills, in mathematics, in history and geography. He was taught with the best Egyptian tutors leadership in leadership skills and undoubtedly military tactics. He stayed in that role as the grandson of Egypt's Pharaoh until he was 40 years old. Stephen tells us that in his speech in Acts 7. Let's look at what happened. Exodus 2, beginning with verse 1. Now a man in the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and floated it with tar and pitch, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister, that is Moses' sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I'll pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you kill the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So Moses made a decision by faith. It was big, literally life-changing. He made a choice by faith to be a person who followed God. Giving up incredible wealth, luxury, status, identity as a man of this world to be a man of God. Not knowing what that meant. For a long time, it meant poverty, hardship, being unknown. He didn't know whether there would ever be on this earth anything different than that. But by faith, he chose to follow God. Why? First, let me deal with what Bible critics say is a contradiction in the Bible. Exodus 2:14 says, "Then Moses was afraid." Our text in Hebrew says, verse 27, "not fearing the king's anger." First, the two texts seem to say the same thing, only opposite. In Exodus, Moses is afraid that he had been found out. In Hebrews, it says he was not afraid of Pharaoh. He obviously wanted to help the Jews in their terrible situation as slaves, and he couldn't if he were dead, so he fled for his life. He fled in an effort to stay alive. We're not critical of a missionary who leaves the country where his life is threatened. Hundreds of missionaries left China when the communists took over. In Acts, Paul and other missionaries left places where their lives were in danger. Hebrews makes it clear that Moses saw that there was a God that he couldn't see, in contrast to the visible idols of Egypt. In his helping the Jews, he was choosing their God too. Pastor Gabe last week talked about how sacred the cat was to the Egyptians, as is obviously depicted in their idols and hieroglyphics. He is a joke that he made up. I thought it was pretty good. Asking us who was Moses' least favorite cat. Moses. I've told that several times this week with resulting moans. But here's another one I made up, and moans are very appropriate. Do you know what Pharaoh wanted to do to Moses? He wanted to purge him from Egypt. P-U-R-R-J. Sorry. So Moses was afraid and not afraid at the same time. We should understand that. Think about this pandemic. We can fear and not fear at the same time. I'm not afraid of death. In fact, in a sense, there's a sense in which I would welcome it. I would get to see Jesus. I'd be in heaven instead of on earth. And my wife is there. I'm nearly 84 with all the troubles and aches and pains of old age. But I don't want to suffer either. And having had it, I did. Let me tell you, it's awful. And it's really scary when you can't breathe and when with every struggled breath you feel like you're drowning. That was scary. I don't know whether I have been angry or just nauseated by Christians quoting from 2 Timothy 1:7, God has not given us a spirit of fear. And this verse has been quoted so often as a reason for not avoiding group gatherings and refusing to wear a mask and so forth. But they don't usually quote the rest of the verse. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Of power means that's the ability to do something about the threat. Of love, that's the willingness to do the loving thing for others. And of a sound mind, that's the wisdom to be cautious, sensible, and safe. Obviously, we can fear and not fear at the same time. Moses left Egypt and spent 40 years getting married, having kids, and herding sheep, while God was preparing him for what he had ahead for him. And while God was waiting for the precise time he was preparing Moses and the Jews for the Exodus and conquest of the land he promised Abraham. And while he was waiting that 40 years for the people living in the promised land to reach their limit of sinfulness. Our verse says at the end, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. I love what Paul said about Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. You know, we, like Moses, persevere because we see Jesus. I love a song that expresses this so well. It's called It Will Be Worth It All by Esther Rishoy. Oftentimes the way seems long, our trials hard to bear. We're tempted to complain, to murmur, and despair. But Christ will soon appear to catch his bride away, all tears forever over in God's eternal day. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race, till we see Christ. Let's go on to 40 years later, verse 28, an act of faith, restoring the faith. Hebrews 11:28. By faith he, Moses, kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Moses had an experience with God. Before this time, before that experience, he was identifying with an unseen God. Then a phenomenal thing happened. It's known as the burning bush. I'm not going to take time to read it, but the unseen God did something. He appeared to Moses in another life-changing experience. He called Moses with that phenomenon to lead Israel. We're not told how Moses did what he did, but he got that mass of ignorant people living in slavery to pay attention to him. I'm not sure how he did that, but I'm sure it stretched every leadership skill he had learned as Pharaoh's grandson, and then some. Let's pick up the story. And I apologize for the lengthy passage, but I think we need it. Exodus 12, beginning 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, each one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight." And by the way, the 4 days, if you look at the time between the triumphal entry and the crucifixion, you've got 4 days, and the date that Christ was crucified was the 14th of Nisan. A picture of that. Christ showed himself for 4 days to be absolutely pure, and then was crucified. Verse 7. Then you are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast it over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it: with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate for generations to come, and you will celebrate as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on those days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. This is all you may do. Celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, because it was on the very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for generations to come. In the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is found in your houses. And whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is an alien or native born. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in a basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of your door frames. Not one of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as promised, observe the ceremony. And when your children ask you, 'What does the ceremony mean to you?' tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.' Then the people bowed down and worshiped. The Israelite did what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron." Now the Bible reading speaks for itself, but just a few comments. Significantly, the very first act of leadership by Moses, in which he got the Jews to do something together, was a religious ritual. That's important, because this separated people. If they were anything, they were God's chosen people, or they were nothing. They needed to do something religious. I heard about an airplane going through a terrible storm, and as the plane shook so much, the people were terrified. Well, there was a pastor on board, and he had gotten acquainted with his seatmate, and knowing how scared everyone was, that seatmate stood up and shouted that there was a pastor there, and he was going to do something religious. So he took an offering. But really, doing something religious is doing something that is of foremost importance. In this pandemic, when all of us go to church, some of us physically in a building, we can still do something religious. It's a Sunday. It's the Lord's Day. We can watch on Zoom or watch later on the church website. Even take communion together. We're no way dependent upon a building, four walls, or street address. We can do a religious thing outside in some room in the house, and God is there. We can honor him. We can worship him anywhere. It's good to go to church when you can, but doing something religious is not dependent on a time or a place. By faith, we do something religious. We worship our unseen God, who is real. And that was Moses' first act of leadership, to do something religious. Let's move on in our text, verse 29. An act of faith, daring the impossible. Hebrews 11:29. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Again, let me read some of the text. Let the Bible tell the story. Exodus 14, beginning with 19. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, when my wife would tell this story to children, she'd get them to imagine themselves being there and going over to the wall of water and putting their finger in it, see if it was real. It was real. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off, so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. This is one of the most amazing stories of the impossible things in the Bible. Now don't try to explain it away by saying that was just a marshy area on the north end of the Red Sea, or that it was a natural shelf in the sea or ridge just under the water. God did an amazing miracle for these people to get them out of Egypt, to give them victory over their enemies, something they could not forget. An encouragement to their faith then and throughout generations to come. Let me ask, what are the impossible challenges in your life now? Can you have the faith it takes to believe that God can do anything about it? Or the faith to believe that God can give you strength to get through it? Is there a Red Sea looming over your day? Trust. Have faith. Believe in our omnipotent, loving God. If Jesus would even suffer and die for you, how does some problem in your life today compare with that? Believe God for the impossible. Now let's go on 40 years later, verse 30. An act of faith, doing the unreasonable. Hebrews 11:30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. Let's go back in our Bibles to Joshua and read at least now just part of the story. The Jews are now in the land, and right in front of them is a big walled city. Joshua 6. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days." Joshua 6:15. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Of course, you know the story. The walls fell down. God did another miracle for them. I wonder why he did it that way. Couldn't he just have had them surround the city and not let anybody in or out until they ran out of water and food? Then the Jews could have just broken down the walls and gone in unopposed. I think God wanted them to take 13 long looks at the impossible. The walls were huge, thick, and high. I understand that the chariots and horses could be driven on top of the wall. And the wall was big enough that there were actually houses built into the wall. And people even living in those walls. We'll see that in a little bit. But God made them do something unreasonable. Unthinkable. Unreasonable. Way to take this strong city. The first conquest in the land. He had them do an unreasonable thing. March around it. Once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times the 7th day. That was the first conquest of the land. A miracle by faith to do an unreasonable thing. Are you obeying God? Walking with Him day by day? But there's something you've prayed about over and over, and you wait wondering why God doesn't do something, wondering if God is listening, wondering if He'll ever answer your prayer. Maybe He wants you to take 13 long looks at the impossible. You can't figure it out. It seems unreasonable to you, but you can then continue marching around day by day, and finally God works. Let's look at our last verse in the text. Verse 31, an act of faith, becoming a cohort. Hebrews 11:31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Again, a brief part of the story of the Bible. Joshua 2:1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Verse 9. And Rahab said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign. That you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, that you will save us from death. Joshua 2:18. Then the spies replied to Rahab, unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father, your mother, and your brothers, and all your family into their house. So they promised deliverance for her house. So clearly, Rahab believed that the God of Israel was the true God. And she used his name. You notice that capitalization of L-O-R-D? That's Yahweh or Jehovah. She named the God of Israel as the true God. She did what she did by faith, believing in that true God. She hid the spies, protecting them and helping them escape. And as many commentators point out, that scarlet cord is an Old Testament picture of the New Testament scarlet cord by which we are delivered, the shed blood of Jesus Christ. As we trust, and then we become, like Rahab, a cohort with the people of God, a member of the family of God. James 2:25, in the same way was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them out in a different direction. If we took time to follow the story, we find that Rahab was accepted in Israel. She married a Jewish man. She became the great-great-grandmother of David and an ancestress of Jesus Christ himself.